Okay, so we're going to begin with Julia Brown, who is a doctoral student in the English department. Julia.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about the importance of peer connection through shared reflective writing exercises, especially during the pandemic. I think this was important before the pandemic, and I kind of wish I had realized how important this was pre-pandemic, but it was really the pandemic that initiated my shared reflective writing. So in my previous life, pre-Stony Brook, pre-pandemic, I had the opportunity to work with Ann Geller and her project, the Meaningful Writing Project. And so the key to that project is working with students and their reflections on creating meaningful writing and learning from students what they find meaningful from writing assignments. So I had written up 4 reflective questions that I wanted students to answer after every major writing assignment that I gave them. And it was, what did you find meaningful, or why didn't you find this project meaningful? What is one thing that you think you were really successful on? What is one thing that you think you could have improved on in this writing? And then the last question was, how do you see this writing benefiting you or not benefiting you in the future? What skills will you take away from this writing project? And during the pandemic, pre-pandemic, I had just had students write answers to these questions and turn them into me, and it was kind of a private reflection between the student and myself. But once we moved online for the pandemic, I actually moved these to discussion board posts and had students write the answers to these reflective questions and respond to 2 of their peers. And in reading student responses, some students were like, this wasn't meaningful because we're in the middle of a pandemic and, nothing's meaningful now. And that, I loved the honesty of that, because I was like, oh, it felt kind of trite asking that question in the middle of a pandemic. I recognize that, but I wanted to ask it anyway. And most students really responded to it. I was teaching a professional writing class, so it was directly connected to the major, the career that the students were going into. But by sharing it with their peers, a lot of the responses were, oh my gosh, I really struggled with that too. And I thought I was the only one who was struggling with doing this part of the assignment. I thought I was the only one who was struggling to write a literature review because I never knew what a literature review was before. I didn't know how to synthesize these sources together. I didn't know XYZ. And it really, it built community through struggle. Through what students were struggling on, and it brought them together to know that they weren't alone in what they were struggling on. And I think that's really important, especially during a pandemic when we're all struggling. And I can see this moving outside of a writing class, or the questions being, tweaked a little bit, or even just brought into the personal realm to share, especially teaching a course on the pandemics, or teaching a course on health humanities, anything like that, where the material does get a little bit more personal. I think this kind of reflective writing can really bring students together through shared experiences, through recognizing that they are not alone in the processes that they're going through. They're not the only ones struggling, whether it be academically or personally. And they also uplifted each other. They said, hey, I got to read your draft. You did a really good job on that. Yeah, you should be proud of that. And so that community building was something that I hadn't seen with the reflective writing in the past. And now I'm going to stick with shared reflective writing moving forward.
Great. Thank you. Perfect timing. You're like right at time. Let me cancel that. Thank you very much. So I think we should have time for responses for each presentation. So if people have comments or thoughts about, for Julia, please jump in. Just either wave at me or raise your hand in the using the hand raise function. I mean, I just have a sort of comment, which is this.
Christina has her hand up.
Christina, go. Okay, good. Yeah, Christina.
Hi, Julia. That was so great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I agree that what I liked and what resonated with me was the how I think my experience teaching during the pandemic and what you're describing was that students were really craving that kind of connection and the kind of connection that would happen really spontaneously in the classroom, you know, that they would just have that kind of exchange with each other was much more challenging the way that we were teaching. And so the way that you thoughtfully occasioned that, made an occasion for that connection through, pivoting and putting those conversations online. I think that's really smart. So I really appreciated that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I was just I'll jump in and tag on to what Christina was saying. I also think it's important that you sort of recognized and captured the possibility of the discussion board, the asynchronous. This is one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, partly as a reaction to this kind of ideology of in-person, that in-person is best. But it seems to me that one of the things we really learned was that this asynchronous can really work for a lot of students. And it seems like you captured that they were able asynchronously to kind of collaborate and uplift each other. So that's really, I think, important.
Yeah, I was teaching and still teaching my summer courses all asynchronously because I'm, it works for me. It worked for me when I was a student. And so I wanted to capture that, but I wanted to do, the things that worked for me and make them better for my students and not have them, because I know so many of them are like, oh no, it's asynchronous. I haven't seen a single person in a year. Yeah. And so trying to create those opportunities I found was really important.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you, Julia. And I know, here's Liz in the chat. I'm trying to monitor the chat as well. I absolutely agree, Ray, the generative possibilities of async modalities. Yeah, and we really, I do think this is really important that we communicate this. There's too much going on right now where there's a generalizing, I think a real problematic generalizing of the student, the ideal student and what the student wants. I know, yes, as Julia said, I have had students who don't like asynchronous at all and can't handle it. Okay, so yes, there are those, but there are also many who do. So it's this generalizing that I think is one of the problems pedagogically.
It's also, just to add that it's nice to hear something that has worked specifically for discussion boards, because when I've done those for asynchronous classes, I really was not happy with how they worked out. So it's nice to get a suggestion of something that you feel has worked productively on a discussion board, because I found that a really difficult kind of mode to work with. So that's really helpful. So your four questions were, did you find this productive? Not, what do you think you could do better? What do you think worked?
Yeah, and did you find it meaningful? What is one thing you were proud of in your writing? What is one thing that you could do better? And how will you use this in the future, or won't you? Because I'm also all about transfer of skills.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. And I know, I'll just say, Julia might have to skip out early, so thank you. And yes, and please, folks, the chat is happening, so use the chat to kind of continue these discussions. Also, another point about Zoom, which Josh is bringing up. So our next presenter is Josh Taplitzky, who's a professor in the history department. And I'm sorry, I didn't mention this about Julia, but his topic is pandemics, a course that he taught, and the first week's assignments for that course. So Josh.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? I may have a somewhat unstable internet connection. Karen, do I have an unstable? Shoot. Okay, I hope this will work. I'm going to try my best with this. And if it doesn't, just kick me out and we'll done with it. Okay, so I was teaching a course last semester, a History 401 course, a course that's designed to have advanced undergraduate students produce their own original research. And I'm so delighted to be going right after Julia, because where Julia was interested in forging really important communal connections between students, I used a different priority, a complementary priority that I had was to engage and have students create connections with times and places before our own in order to build forms of empathy, to use their present experience as a lens, not necessarily a determinative one, but a lens to open their eyes to experiences of the past in ways that they might not otherwise have been attentive to. And so I did a twin pair of, or I guess I did a pair of assignments in the starting weeks of the semester. The first was I asked each of the students quite simply in 250 words or fewer to reflect on one way in which the pandemic had affected their lives. And it was so interesting to get an array of different perspectives from students, some of whom spoke very about bereavement, some of them who spoke about employment, some of them who spoke even positively about the quality time that they now have with family members. And then on the other hand, what I asked students to do was I asked the students to watch the movie Contagion. We collectively watched the film Contagion as a group, and I asked them to select one single theme from the film and then to tie it back to their personal reflections. And my aim in those paired assignments was, on the one hand, to try to bring themselves into the narrative without necessarily centering themselves completely, but rather to raise themes and issues that they could then go looking for in the past. And on the other hand, to globalize it. So I wanted to try to find these two different poles in thinking about pandemics and thinking about epidemics and thinking about historical experience more generally, both to be sensitive to the individuated and also to think about how those plug into much, much larger themes. And I really do recommend the use of the film Contagion. Contagion is really, really nice because it is driven by these interwoven plot points. It's actually almost difficult to articulate a single plot or single driving plot other than pandemic. It is a global film. There are race and class issues, scarcity, the list goes on and on and on, even aside from the health matters. And I found having the students work through these two together, to think on the one hand about the deeply personal, and on the other hand to think about the big, the blockbuster, and all of the variety and array of themes that come up from such a film. I used that as a way to prime them for a semester in which then we would turn to primary sources from 600 years of history, give or take, but as a way of piquing their curiosity, to push them both to think about what really matters to them and also to think beyond that into a full and wider series of issues that come together, converge when it comes to thinking about, with, and through pandemic history. And I think I'll stop there to keep the time.
Great, very, very good and very succinct, and what an assignment. Yeah, that's fantastic. I love it. And I caught it all. I think everybody did. Any comments or questions for Josh? Thoughts? Raise your hands.
Hi, Josh, may I? You did give us like a little glimpse, but could you give us some of the reactions of the students? Could they actually, the work they produce and their perspectives?
Sure. It was so both from the personal and from their it was also just so interesting to see the responses in a given moment. And it was lovely to talk to them about how being part of a particular historical moment, and I really mean moment, I don't mean the entire year, I mean the particular moments we were in, attunes them to aspects of thinking about the pandemics that they otherwise would not have. They were blown away by the point in the film that is about false cures and the use of social media, which to me, I remember the first time I watched this film didn't matter very much to me, but I said exactly that to them and got to talk to them about how we see certain things given our subject positioning, and both the merits of opening our eyes to aspects of the past when something is hot and happening, but also the importance of transcending that when we want to think both sympathetically and empathetically about the past in ways that confront it on its own terms. So that's just one quick example of the give and take between them bringing their deeply personal experiences, but also being able to use that to talk through how to think sensitively about both the I, but also to step outside of themselves into the experiences of others in radically different scenarios, even though they seem like there can be a flattening of pandemic experience across time and space.
That's great. Great question and response. I mean, I was taken with again, this kind of scales, the different scales that you were trying to get them to kind of think about the personal in relation to the global, but how you used particular tools like the film and their response to the film, and also their own reflection to kind of get them to move. And that's one of the things I think is really interesting. How do we move between those scales? So I was really impressed by that. Do you think they were aware that you were intending them to do that?
And later in the semester, I think it clicked for them. And in the moment, I'm not, as much as I even tried to be completely pedagogically transparent with them to say, this is what I'm trying to get you to get out of this. Sometimes that clicks and sometimes it doesn't. And but it was interesting as the semester went on, as they actually started writing their own papers, they said, oh, we get it now. Well, some did. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Great. That's great.
I have a question.
Nancy has
Josh, fabulous. As a fellow historian, this is just a model of what I think we bring to the conversation. My question is about responding to potential cries for help from students. And when I get to my part of the slam, I'll talk more about that, but trying to be aware. I'll just say I rewatched Contagion, and it spiked my already pandemic anxiety. It's quite a terrifying experience. So I just wondered, did you have anybody freak out? I mean, they probably wouldn't share it with you, but I'm just, I think you understand the question I'm asking.
I'm really glad you're asking the question, and maybe that will give me an opportunity also to add an exercise that happened almost naturally in my class, was that we would use the first 15 minutes to do a kind of check-in about where everybody was in the wider world of the pandemic. I hadn't even done that with complete intentionality. It was my goal just to sort of shoot the breeze and create an environment in which students felt comfortable getting to talk to each other. And over the course of the semester, it evolved into a what is happening in your pandemic world. And then we would also chat about the state of current events, which is something that I think all of us were very attuned to, but our students are not always necessarily following the headlines and looking at the contact tracing. It was a way of bringing them into thinking carefully and critically about the moment, but also articulating their stress, their anxiety. As the semester was unfolding, different students reported on, I'm eligible now for the vaccine. Oh, somebody else is home sick with the vaccine. There was a whole world of just processing and sharing and talking about their own comfort levels as we moved through it. And I was really glad that it emerged organically. I wish I wish I had planned that in advance, but I'm delighted that it emerged organically as a group with these students there. So I'm hoping that gets to part of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Yes.
Sensitively there.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. That was fantastic. Okay, so next up, we have Karen Roy, who's a professor in art history. And you were talking about sending a message, Carrie Mae Weems's Resist COVID Take 6 project. Okay.
All right, so I'm an art historian and I have to have images, so give me a moment.
I think I had to allow you. There you go.
I can't help myself. 1 second.
Yeah.
And I have to also, I've done a classic presenter move of I've changed my title and what I'm talking about slightly. So apologies. So as an art historian, one of my main goals in the classroom is to help students to think about how images and visual forms create meaning in distinct ways. So I'm going to start by talking through some images to set up the discussion before coming to how I've used this pedagogically in a couple of specific examples and for 2 specific pedagogical purposes. So this semester and every fall going forward, I teach a class called Art and Medicine. It's a large 120-person introductory level course that addresses the historical and contemporary intersections of medicine and the arts. Yesterday, we had a guest speaker to start off the semester, artist Chantal Zakari. In 2020, Zakari published an artist's book called Drop Dead Gorgeous, which brings together scientific photographs, scientific illustrations, and editorial illustrations of the COVID-19 virus to think about the aesthetics of scientific photography and the chronological unfolding of this pandemic. Based on the enthusiastic reception of the book and the constantly changing experience of the pandemic, she published a 2nd edition in February 2021, which carries the story forward. So you see the 2 covers here, the 1st edition and the 2nd one on the right. So the book offers a narrative. The virus arrives as a burst of light, as something epic and almost mythical, mysterious and unknown. The virus and the often stock images that depict it travel around the world, the same representation appearing with texts in a multitude of languages and accompanying a host of different discussions. In informative but not overly graphic editorial imagery, it impacts the human body, restricting airflow and shutting down systems. It is fought using existing medications and eventually vaccines. The images in the book were all taken from online sources. Zakari did not alter them in any way. Her work consisted of collecting, arranging, and juxtaposing the images to create a story over 100 pages. The book offers a narrative, but it is one created out of an already existing narrative, one generated in magazines, journals, and newspapers all over the world as we have lived through this pandemic. The bright, saturated colors and dynamic, appealing images are exactly as she found them, drop dead gorgeous. Students asked many excellent questions about Zakari's aims in the reception of her work, but one misunderstanding persisted. Students asked why she made the colors so bright. Why was there so much red? Was it controversial or ethically problematic to make the images so beautiful? The confusion signals one of the main points of Zakari's project, that these scientific, theoretically objective images are not what they seem. Existing in the realm of publishing and of business, they are meant to be appealing, to draw attention and to draw you in as a reader. Some aspects of them, like the basic form of the virus, are based in the science, but other major factors like color, texture, and composition are left up to the illustrator. In many cases, especially for editorial imagery, those illustrators are working in bulk and for minimal pay, and interestingly creating intentionally kind of images void of meaning so they can be used in lots of different contexts. It's worth noting that the virus does not have to be shown with such brilliant color. Artist Luke Jerram offers instead a mesmerizingly clear glass ball, at once substantial and fragile. So to prepare for Zakari's talk, to get back to the pedagogy, I asked students to draw the COVID-19 virus. Here are some of the sketches. The spiky ball of the virus predominates. Only the ubiquitous masks challenge it for the dubious honor of visual brand of the virus. My course, our ARH 107, is not a studio class. but I want students to experience and reflect on how they've processed the pandemic in ways they have perhaps not even realized. Discussing Zakari's book in the classroom accomplishes what I see as a fundamental pedagogical purpose. It guides students and all of us who consume medical imagery, however passively, to ask questions that we didn't know we needed to ask. What decisions go into depicting the physical form of a debilitating virus, and who is making those decisions? What is the cumulative effect of seeing such seductively beautiful images over and over? What does it mean for the form of the virus itself to be commercialized? Zakari's book shows how illustrations of COVID-19 often have a fundamental ambivalence and deliberately ambiguous meaning, so they can be used in a variety of contexts. I know I've only got a couple of seconds, but I'll show you one more thing. Ambivalence and ambiguity are two key techniques used by artist Carrie Mae Weems in her COVID project titled Resist COVID Take 6. The series of posters and billboards of the Take 6 project take up the seemingly neutral format of informational or motivational communication. A single black and white photograph is combined with large declarative text. As the website for the project declares, the goal is to, quote, educate and enlighten Black, Brown, and Native American communities on the impact of this deadly virus on their lives. Despite the apparent clarity of the structure, there are fractures in the relationship of text and image, particularly if you recognize the photograph as one captured during the August 28, 1963 March on Washington. The combination of text and image raises questions. Who needs to keep a distance? Who is too close? And what are they too close to? Zakari's and Weems' projects use found imagery and the visual languages of public health communication, and both are intended to reach broad audiences. However, through their juxtapositions and incongruities, they subvert the expected messages of their form and ask questions rather than answering them. My pedagogical purpose in working through this material in the classroom is to get students asking questions, to sit and get comfortable with productive ambiguity. Thank you. Also for putting up with me going very fast. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, you went slightly over, but fantastic. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks,
questions or comments for Karen?
If anybody wants to look at the book, I have it floating around my office. On
Yeah.
campus.
Did you record her presentation, Karen?
I believe that we did, yes.
Okay, could you make that?
Yeah,
But I wasn't able to come, but I would love, okay, bless you. Thank you.
Yeah, Adrian did. So, and I was thinking about
Yeah, of course.
writing something about it, or and getting some student response to put something onto the
Oh,
website.
lovely, lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great for the website because I also
Yeah.
couldn't either. Sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Questions or comments for Karen?
I want to take your class.
Thanks.
I have a
It was
potentially.
a fantastic presentation, and the students had very good questions. A lot of them you kind of summarized there, but it kept striking in my mind. It kept striking this kind of connection between, some kind of a new frontier that is behind the rhetoric of the virus. This is space kind of,
Yes.
we're going into an unknown planet, an unknown, and the virus being given a story. And I was thinking about that, do the students have like different stories for the virus? Like she presented this kind of hero, the virus as a hero that moves from, a miraculous birth into, all this powerful existence. And I was thinking if you had any sense from the questions of the students or from your own class, that the students are drawing other narratives of maybe the opposite, the villain instead of the hero.
Right. That's a really good question. Actually, I'll put that to them tomorrow. So tomorrow we meet again. We had the lecture yesterday, and tomorrow we meet again. And I was going to start the class off by saying, how has looking at this changed your sort of understanding of looking at these images? So I'll put that question to them and ask exactly that, because their questions to her didn't necessarily get to that. And a lot of them, they looked at sort of excerpts of the book, but they hadn't looked at the whole thing or thought about the whole thing really carefully. So I think that's a question that I can take back to them.
I just have a quick comment. Nothing normatively to be read into this, but aesthetically, your presentation induces the audience to take the perspective of the virus, whatever that means. I'm not even sure what it means. especially the image drawn by one of your students. I'm sorry, I'm not that bad. I mean, what's behind the intention of that communication? Anyway, I just leave that open. It's interesting.
Yeah, and that was actually something that Chantal talked about yesterday, is that the images, because they're so beautiful, because they're so seductive, they have exactly that effect. They sort of draw you in to sort of empathize with the virus as this sort of living dynamic thing. And that's kind of part of the purpose of the book, is to think about the effects of that and this kind of imagery that we see every day. As I said, this is all imagery she's taken from online sources. She's gone through newspapers and journals and sort of collected what's there. And so these are things that are already out there in a kind of visual consciousness already. And so what is the kind of impact of that?
I wondered if there was resistance from the students to this being art. I mean, that
Yes.
her work, and of course I love it, but using all found sources and combining.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
There were some funny questions that sort of tried to ask that without saying that, and sort of displacing it. Of, has anyone ever accused you of being lazy because you don't make images? You gotta collect them together. But this is why we need to talk about this, right? That this is a fundamental skill, of looking. And then this is the sort of primary thing that I always am teaching in classes, is looking is a skill. It has to be something active. It has to be something thoughtful. Thinking through images is something you have to learn to do. And so collecting is an active process, right? Collecting and shaping is an active process. But yes, absolutely, that sense is out there.
That's great. No, great response too. Great. Thank you so much, Karen. That's fantastic. Okay, next we have Nancy Toms, who is a professor in the history department, and you're going to be talking about how the pandemic is revealing or intensifying challenges of sustaining mental health and substance abuse services and challenges of differentiating information from misinformation. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So let me just get my stopwatch on here so I can keep an eye on myself. If you're on this call, relax. This is going to be much more untidy. And let me start with the spoiler is I was on leave last year. I had a sabbatical arranged before the pandemic. So in fact, my pandemic teaching is just starting, at least pandemic teaching in the classroom. If you don't know me, my areas of specialization, get this, are the history of mental health and mental illness, and pandemics, infectious disease, the history of public health. So unfortunately, the pandemic crosses the two areas that I have worked on in the last 30, 40 years. Pretty weird. I just want to start by a promotion, not for myself, but by another wing of the Pandemic Narratives Project, and that's the student engagement team. I know Kathy's on the call. I don't know if anybody else. Hi. One of the things that this subgroup is trying to do is find student engagement opportunities outside the classroom. And we're having an event on September 29th. It's already posted on the website, but I'll send out additional flyers. Undergraduates who've been podcasting already taught themselves to podcast and have been dealing with the pandemic in various ways. They are going to talk about their experience. They are recruiting additional students. Queer Diagnosis, I think, now has at least 8 students signed up through Women's Studies to help with this. So long story short, I'm learning from them. I'm not teaching them, they're teaching me. And we are finding this incredibly exciting. The course I am teaching this semester is one, this is the 3rd time I've done it. It's the history of the American mental hospital with a documentary focus on Kings Park, the hospital now closed in Kings Park. It's based in part on documentary work that I did with Lucy Weiner for her Stony Brook graduate, by the way, BA in English. This incredible film about her own experience as a teenage patient in Kings Park, and that what she went back as a filmmaker to discover about the past of the hospital itself. So in this course, I take students through the history of mental illness and its treatment with an eye on contemporary issues. Obvious potential here to talk about pandemics and their impact on existing problems, challenges, trends. For the second paper option for that course, I am inviting students, this is where they get to do something on their own interests, to do a project, however they want to frame it, on what the pandemic reveals about the state of mental health services, wherever they want to go look. It wouldn't necessarily even have to be the United States, and go do the research and the thinking, what's out there, what are we finding out, but then bring it back to their understanding, which I hope they've gotten by then, of the persistent problems, stigmatization, the limits of the biomedical model, on and on and on. The failures of deinstitutionalization, problems of respecting the perspectives of people with severe and persistent mental illness, all that kind of important stuff, using that historical framing to reflect on the present. So I'll be very excited to share the results. One of the things the student engagement team wants to do is have a meeting later this semester where we can bring all examples of all the work that we're doing together to talk about it. The other project I'm working on is more a teaching in the public health sector about the problem of the modern infodemic. And since I'm almost out of time, I think I'm going to be giving a talk about that at Glasgow University in October. So if you want to hear about that project, then I'll talk more about it, but it's certainly very timely. What is misinformation? Good question there. That's it.
Thank you. Right at the bell. Right at the bell. Cancel. Yeah, and I think there's information about your talk on the website, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
again, our website, we're trying to keep it up with, and also information about the podcast project is on the website as well. So questions or comments for Nancy? Who's got one?
I've just stunned everyone with silence.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I'm very interested in is thinking about this, how we relate the past to the present. And so and I think our generalization, which is sort of not fair, but this sort of notion of not a lot of interest in history, but are you finding that actually their experience in relation to the pandemic and maybe their own issues around mental health allow them, it becomes kind of a portal into the past?
Interesting question, because you probably hear all the time, our students aren't interested in history. Not my experience at all. The majority of students in this class are psych majors. And I've been astounded at their level of interest from the get-go. So they're not struggling at all with the relevance of what we're doing. I think they've come into the class with a strong sense that our mental health system is broken, and they're there to find out why. I've not had any, I haven't had to use the pandemic to spark their interest at all. And that's been my experience. There's something about this subject, I think, that really of just changing views of neurodiversity, neuroatypicality. They are so on that. In one of our discussions, I asked them what they thought the real, the challenge of stigma was in their lives. And the answer was basically my parents and my grandparents, that the boomers, we're the problem, that we have such repressive ideas that they're actually much more open. So, I don't know if I entirely, you talked about generalizations, that's probably an overgeneralization. But I get more resistance to why history is important from science faculty at Stony Brook than I do from my students.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you, Nancy. Anyone else, comments or questions?
So what kinds of materials do they find for their own research projects? Like, how do you direct them? What kinds of things do they end up basing their individual projects on?
Karen, it's a really, it's a good opportunity to try to teach them very simple skills of information retrieval. And so we talk through things like peer review, what's a credible source. So they kind of get a little boot camp in what I will and won't accept. Grandpa Joe's QAnon post, oh well, unless you want to use that as a primary source. So we basically use the databases that we can get through Melville. And kind of go through some basics of how to do research. And again, they vary in how comfortable they are with the doing the historical side of it. But again, these are psych majors, a lot of sociology. That finding the data doesn't really put them off that much. At least in the past it hasn't. We'll see this time around.
Can you hear me? I hope I'm unmuted on the phone.
Yes, you are.
Hi, this is Bobby Kohler calling online. Thank you so much. Hi. I just have a question about this particular point in time that this pandemic has arrived, and with your great, scope and perspective of the history of mental health and pandemics. Do you find, or is there an indication that because we have the internet, because we have all kinds of technology, that the impact is different at this point in time than it might have been before?
I definitely think that, Bobby. And in fact, one of the things I'm trying to do as a historian is sort out how much is interactive social media and how much is a previous generation of internet access where you could get information, but you couldn't basically give your critique of it. So that's actually something that I'm very much part of the project I'm doing for the World Health Organization, is to try to help them sort out what has been the impact of the internet. I don't believe that all the problems with misinformation originated with the internet. And that is actually something I hear people say, that if I do nothing but hold my hand up and say, no, 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 I feel like I've done I'm sure, Josh, you just get nuts when you hear this. But trying to historicize the concept of information and how it's commodified and spread around is really important. And it's something that I think critical humanities and social sciences have to offer the hard sciences. But sometimes, well, we have to work hard to get them to listen. And a pandemic is a good time. They do pay more attention to you in a situation like this.
And by extension, though, I understand completely, but by extension, I do know of loads of therapists who have been able to reach out and do therapy because of the internet. So that's an interesting, another aspect of the usage of that. And that is something that couldn't have been done on this level before. So I think, you know, the therapeutic is also an interesting mental health aspect of it.
I completely agree. And that's a really, that's something I'm going to try to get some of my students to get interested in, and that I myself am really, in my research interest, totally agree that that is very significant. Even things like I'm finding out the use of apps by people with mental health diagnoses, that rather than risk having the police come and mishandle them, they use apps to alert their support groups to come and help them and sort of keep them out of a more carceral kind of response. That is just, you know, a whole nother kind of interactivity that I find very interesting.
And I see
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your questions. Those are great.
Elise also has a hand up, so go ahead, Elise.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to respond to something that you said, Nancy, that stood out to me, because I think something I have observed from my students too, one of the things that like elicits the most excited response in the last couple of semesters. I also teach the history of art and medicine like Karen, and in the pandemics unit, we look at pandemic or vaccine skepticism from previous pandemics. And I think students feel a bit of a defensiveness around the internet, because for many of them, it has been such a resource to connect around mental health, among other things. And I feel like there's almost a sense of relief that vaccine skepticism, among other disinformation, is not indigenousness to the internet, but rather has this super long history. Because I think oftentimes the association of the internet with disinformation and a lack of literacy can come off somewhat offensive to a generation that the internet has been such an important community space for.
Yeah. And I try very hard because I'm very big on engagement of all sorts, that the value of that kind of access, so you get information that's useful to you. It's like it's balancing that. But I think that's a really good point. I don't want to come across as a boomer to them. And yeah, something they help me with. Again, they are teaching me. I am not up there, you know, the explainer. They're helping me understand. So, as you are, and thank you for your comments. Those were really helpful.
Thank you, Nancy. And just a plug for Alice Wong, who we're going to host on October 7th. You're going to get another where you're going to see disability activists using social media and using hashtag activism in really important ways. So I think that kind of fits in with the comments and Nancy's presentation. Okay, so next we have Elise Armani, who is a doctoral student in art history. And Elise is going to talk about the Stony Brook COVID Museum and collective knowledge production. You're on, Elise.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm going to share my screen because I too have slides like a typical art historian.
Sure.
Let's see. Okay. So as I just mentioned, I also teach the history of art and medicine, and two of the sort of primary goals that I have adopted from TAing with Karen are attempting to sort of expand students' capacity to see visual and non-linguistic information, both art and otherwise, around them, and to then observe the interplays between that visual information and the sort of visual culture and social politics of visual material, to understand the capacity of art to generate and communicate ideas and ideologies. So I would like to humbly think that this project may have helped them move towards these goals, but even if it didn't, I think it helped all of us sort of survive what was otherwise a tough semester with a project that felt applicable and significant, but also manageable and, quite frankly, easy, which I think was an important thing to just strive for in the last year. So the project that I want to share with you, I called the Stony Brook COVID Museum. Don't tell university branding, this is not approved. But my prompt for students was to proactively think about what art historians of the future might think or might want to learn about COVID-19, and then to view themselves as witnesses to that moment. So their instructions were to take a picture each week and submit it to me, which I then shared on the collective Instagram page. And to take a picture specifically of COVID-19, not of the virus in the sense of Chantal Zakari, but rather to think about COVID-19 instead as objects, settings, events, etc., that were occurring in their everyday life. So through this, my goals were both on a pedagogical level to demonstrate their ability to contribute directly and collaboratively to a historical record, and to facilitate the application of other ideas we were looking at in our history to their daily lives, but also on a more human level to help foster a sense of connection and community in the classroom. And I also found that it was quite helpful for myself to stay cognizant of the realities of their lives throughout the pandemic, because even though it sometimes felt like this collective experience where we were all stuck at home and spending too much time on Zoom, through looking at these photos, I realized that many of my students were working as EMTs or in restaurants or caregivers, and in general were experiencing the pandemic in really different ways that then impacted their capacities to participate in class. So that was also important for me to then keep in mind going forward in the semester. So let me switch my slide. So here's an example of two of the photos that were submitted. And as you might imagine, there were lots of parallels that emerged and themes that emerged throughout all of the photos from the semester. The goals of the project, and I'm just going to take my last bit of time just to run through some of the results. So again, the desire to create a collaborative historical record and sort of challenge their notion of what constitutes history. Even just looking through some of these images today for the presentation, I was already struck by how much the visuality of the pandemic, which we remain in the midst of today, has changed from September of 2020 when the project started. The students observed details that now seem perhaps ubiquitous, like flyers or half trampled stickers on the floor for social distancing, etc. But others seem somewhat interesting or strange, even just, a year later, Lysol in groceries, wristbands for those who pass temperature checks, etc. And again, we're able to then connect those details back to classroom discussions. It also prompted a reflection on loneliness, emptiness, lack of connection, while allowing students to connect around those experiences. And as I mentioned previously, I learned things like one of my students was an EMT and experiencing the pandemic from the back of an ambulance. So I'll just mention that the final result of the project was that they had to choose one of their classmates' pictures and write their final museum paper that used to be about going to New York institutions instead on one of their classmates' submissions. So I got really great examples of visual analysis and also connections to ideas like memento mori and art historical examples as well. So was really pleased with what the students contributed. Thanks. Sorry, that was a lot, really fast.
I think most of your comments are coming up in the comments section of this is fantastic. It's such a great idea.
Fantastic. And I don't think this is premature to say that we are hoping maybe to think about putting in a public history or some kind of proposal, and also use it to try to jumpstart health humanities at Stony Brook in the future. And this just seems like such a perfect example of the potential that we have. Really, really cool.
Thank you.
Sorry, I've lost, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I've lost my visual, so someone else take over for a second. So I can't actually see you guys for some reason. I don't know what happened. Just hang on. Let me see if I can find it.
Kathy, are you just scratching your head, or are you, yeah. Yeah, she doesn't have, she's scratching her head.
Oh.
Oh, that's just.
I think everyone's going off to try and add the Instagram.
Well, I have to say, so it's private, but I'll add you as followers, partially for fear of brand getting it taken down, but also one thing I learned from doing this was that my own capacity to go through these and post them on Instagram every week was like beyond what I should have budgeted for my time for the semester. So I didn't continue the project in this public forum after the fall 2020 semester because it was just like too much for me as a grad student, but I did continue to collect photos. So maybe in some other forum, I can share all of the photos in the future.
Did you find when it came to the final assignment that students gravitated to particular images and wrote about them, or did they sort of select from across the board?
No, I think there was definitely some like thematic groupings. As you mentioned in your presentation, of course, the masks, flyers and signs. I think some things lended themselves a bit easier to the project. And some of the photos were a bit more strange, or the connection to this idea of COVID was maybe more tenuous for someone that wasn't taking the photo. But I think those were maybe some of the more interesting photos anyway, to think about, you know, that it wasn't a mask or a flyer or something, but some other way that people were seeing COVID in their lives.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I just my screen went AWOL, but that was so fantastic, Elise. And I see there's lots of really great comments.
I think Catherine does have a question now.
I just want, first of all, I loved it. I just am blown away by the lasting impact that project will have. They'll be looking, as they're just moving through life, differently, I think, in the coming months. And just because of what you've asked them to take in terms of looking at the photo, looking at other people's photos, I just think it's going to connect them to what's happening in the moment, even when they're very far from the classroom. I really like it. I thought it was brilliant. Really good.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Elise. And yeah, share that. We want to see the Instagram. Yeah. And Nancy's right, put it up on the website, please. Okay, now we have Andy, hopefully who can speak, but if not, I will take over for him, who is a professor in English and public health, and who will be presenting on public health, humanities, ethics questions.
Thank you,
How's your
Lisa.
voice?
One of the experiences in this pandemic has been teaching through a mask, so I apologize. My voice sounds a little different. Originally, I was just gonna try to informally share some experiences where I'm fusing the policy implications of a public health approach to containing the pandemic with humanist reflections. But when I lost my voice, I wrote this up this morning. I woke up, I couldn't speak. So if she had to, Lisa could read it. So this is more formal than I expected, but won't take long. So in discussing the last year and a half with my students, one pedagogical goal of mine has been to get past false dichotomies. In asking how best to cope with this pandemic, cross binaries tend not to be helpful. For example, we shouldn't construe the left as the hall monitors onerously insisting on mitigation, while characterizing the right as the striders back to normal, here to save the economy. These caricatures are inimical to the goals of pro-science, humane public policy crafting, where one seeks to take the perspective of all of the diverse segments of the populations affected by COVID-19, where one seeks to balance trade-offs in a thoughtful manner. Shutting down came at a particularly harsh cost to the poor. Indeed, in periods of economic downturn, it's not only or even mainly businesses and corporations which languish, but the least resourced and most vulnerable among us. Opening us, seeing this light becomes a common goal, not a partisan cause. So with this qualification, a series of questions, and here I just offer a bunch of questions for our consideration. What does it mean to think of the elderly, the poor, the disabled, those suffering from depression and mental disease, children who depend on the nourishment and sustenance they daily receive in the schools they attend, the homeless, and victims of domestic and child abuse when we make decisions about social distancing? On what ethical basis are schools, churches, and places of business left open or closed? What are the costs of leaving these decisions up to us as individuals, as opposed to the government, which decides for the good of a population of individuals? New questions arise with the advent of vaccines. When and to what extent, for the sake of creating a public health policy intended to keep a population healthy, does it make sense to regulate our individual freedoms? What does it mean for America to be a nation focused on liberties? And at what point does liberty lapse into tyranny? What are the thresholds for mandates? If I choose not to vaccinate, despite that I am medically eligible to do so, who do I affect in my choice besides myself and immediate family and friends? Does this matter? Who owes whom what in this world? Did the pandemic help us to clarify? Finally, there are questions for us to answer for ourselves, which take us beyond public policy and ethics and are more of a personal nature, probing the thresholds of our existential predicament. What do we learn about ourselves in the last 18 months? What do we learn we value about being with other people when we're forced to be deprived of their company? How is this question pondered when we think of the welfare and well-being of the other living creatures with whom we share this planet? What is human flourishing? What do we know now that we didn't? What will we change, into what do we wish to return? My own mind is far from made up, and I do look forward to sharing this journey of better understanding and learning from all of you. And I just want to close by saying that I love to term these sorts of questions non-no-brainer issues. They're not rhetorical questions, which means they're not questions to which in asking them, I already know the answer. These are every single question I just raised, I've already raised, as Julia could have attested if she were still on the call. She's in a course I'm teaching on medical humanities and disability studies with PhD students from English. They're all questions where intelligent people can furnish different answers. So, it's a perfect opportunity to learn from students. So I had more to say, but I'm going to preserve my voice and turn it over to questions or comments.
Thank you, Andy. You made it. Yeah, that was great.
Sorry about that. That was rough.
Yeah, questions or comments for Andy about questions and how we pose them. I think, and what is a question? This kind of connects with a lot of the presentations as well. I mean, how do we formulate questions about the pandemic? Who wants to jump in?
I really thank you, Andrew, because you open up the question in so many different directions. And, I think open it up, I think we get too focused on the specific impact on ourselves, our families, but I think as researchers on the human dimension, and you also mentioned the environmental, which I think is very important. And I think it's all linked, like you said, with all the other creatures and living beings that we share the planet with. And I really thank you for that. I really, think that the way you open up the discussion is the right way to go. And as you have mentioned before, that I think we should take up in larger forums at the university to actually see what the answers are or the thinking is from some of our administrators and other faculty too, and students, of course. Just a comment.
That's great, Adrian. And I think I noticed too, the creatures, I mean, thinking about not kind of looking at this in a human-centric way. Elise, I see your hand, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess on like a practical pedagogical level, like do you find it, if prompting with these huge, some controversial questions, like what is the process then of facilitating the conversation that ensues, or does the conversation, I guess I think it's brave to ask such questions in this open format. And I would think I would find myself intimidated by the potential for certain answers, and then how to facilitator responds to them as the instructor.
Yeah, I mean, we say in public health, this is a long-standing controversy in the field and discipline of public health, and I could let our director, Lisa Ben-Scott, address this as well. But do we stay in our lane, or is this political? And now the trend seems to be the political is the personal, is the ethical, is the policy making, which is to say, the protests that happened in May 2020 and beyond, that is public health. Okay, racial justice is part and parcel of social disparities. That we don't have the luxury of simply neutrally thinking of ourselves as acquiring and analyzing data. To what use is this put? Why do we take censuses? So I and many of my colleagues are firmly of the belief that we shouldn't shy away from these issues. But of course, in one moment, as soon as you say that, the onus is on you to create a safe space with which to address these issues. So I'm a very, as anybody who knows me, pro-mandate person. In fact, I think the anti-vax versus vax debate is a false kind of way to go, because that's, denial of facts versus affirmation of facts. But whether to, enforce a certain good, that's an interesting question. And there are costs on both sides there. So I feel like, despite that I have a strong view, I can safely open up this question for discussion in the other graduate course I'm teaching this semester, which is Contemporary Issues in Public Health, which is a thrilling, interesting course for me to teach for just the reason you suggested. While at the same time, I will be less tolerant of someone who wants to stand on a soapbox and denounce the efficacy and safety of vaccines. To me, that's scientific Holocaust denying. That's racism. It's not as offensive is racism, for example, but it is certainly is ignorant in my view. So anyway, you're right. It's a risk it's a pedagogical risk to raise these questions.
That's a great response. Thank you, Andy. Anyone else?
Lisa had their hand up.
Hi,
Yeah.
everybody. My name was invoked, so I'll jump in. I'm the director of the public health program for Stony Brook University. And Andy said a phrase that I've used among our faculty. We have a very diverse faculty in terms of their content expertise. And when the pandemic occurred, you can imagine that the public health program was contacted quite a bit from outside sources and inside sources to lend a few words or respond to maybe a policy or practice that was coming up in the news. And so we kind of had a meeting and I said, stay in your lane, but everybody has a lane. And just listening to this conversation, the pandemic and health affects all of us and our disciplines, and we all have something to say. But what I meant by that was, if you're a health economist, you might not want to go toe to toe on News 12 with the county health commissioner on whether or not the pandemic is worse than the flu. That might not be a good idea. You might want to stay in your lane and talk about the economic impact of the pandemic on Long Island or New York or beyond. If you're a sleep disparities expert or environmental health expert or a health disparities expert, there is absolutely a lane for you and a place for you to contribute. So I'm excited to be part of these conversations. I want to thank you for inviting the broad campus community, because I'm learning how the pandemic has infiltrated, exposed, and really expanded the creativity that we all have in how we teach and learn together. A new lens for us to showcase what we were already doing, but again, in a creative new way. Nancy, I'm so jealous of you having a sabbatical in the thing that you do during the thing that you do. I mean, how fantastic is that? That's just wonderful. What a privilege and opportunity. So I guess what I'm trying to say is whether it's reflecting and pushing forward or the built environment or ethics, whatever it is, we all have an opportunity and all have a lane in this story that's taking us in new directions. And Andy is fantastic at having the courage to ask hard questions. He asks them to our students. He asks them to our county health commissioners. Where do you draw the line on individual freedoms versus policy. And our commissioners say the same thing. You know, we are in the business of protecting, preventing, promoting the public's health, and the collective we. And so if that means giving up an individual freedom, you know, to wear a seatbelt, to not smoke in public places, and to get vaccinated, I sleep fine at night. That's okay. So it just really depends on who you're asking the question to.
I just want to quickly say, I'd forgotten you said that, Lisa, and I completely agree with that sense of stay in your lane. Don't overstate your area of expertise. 100% agree with that. I simply meant that the entire discipline of public health is a little bit larger than I think it was originally construed when Jon Snow, not the hero from Game of Thrones, but with an H,
The other Jon Snow.
The other Jon Snow discovered the cause of cholera in the mid-19th century. And we went from a miasma theory to a germ theory of disease. That even then, the overcoming of miasma through this notion that was just becoming learned of contagiousness was highly controversial, because there was no longer a theological directive. You misbehave and you will get the plague. Now we were connected to people whose first and last names we didn't know whether we liked it or not, because as Karen's art depicts, I thought, so metaphorically, this virus makes no distinction. It's a great democracy. It's its own entity. Anyway.
I want to add to that narrative in this company, you know, the medicalization of public health. Yes. So the Jon Snow story got adopted by medical historians, but for me, examples of public health start with, you know, making sure that children have shoes so they don't get ringworm, or making sure they have access to food, you know, feeding programs, and vitamin A, and fortification of rice and other essential foods. So the things that got picked up by medical schools is, oh, that's public health, is mostly a medical story.
Yes.
Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Really interesting. Yeah. That's a really great point, and a point that it requires us to kind of think interdisciplinarily about crossing disciplines. Wow, that's really, yeah, I hadn't thought about it quite like that. Very smart. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Andy. Okay, next up we have Adrian Perez-Malgoza, who is going to talk, who is director of HISB and also a professor in Hispanic languages and literatures. And you're going to talk about your Mapping Long Island project a little bit.
Unmute. He's muted.
He isn't.
Well,
there he is.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Lisa, for inviting me for this forum. And thank you, everyone, for your presentations. Really, really a lot of food for thought. I think it strikes me how we have all mentioned a little bit of class, race, and gender issues, but we have not really focused straight on, specifically on class, race, and gender. And I think that the pandemic has a lot of impact, that it can be reread through the optics of each one of these perspectives. I'm going to focus specifically more on the Latino issue on Long Island, but this doesn't mean that Latinos are more deserving than others to be studied in this way. That's is what I do. And at the same time, I think they present a very specific, interesting case of how we can reread the past again through the focus that the pandemic has brought on specific impacts. Let me very briefly try to share my screen, and I have, of course, changed to the other pre-existing condition. I'm calling it for the others. And one thing that struck me again from Chantal Zakari's and today's from Karen Lloyd's presentation is that this anthropomorphism that the virus has been endowed with. As we know, it's viruses are a big discussion whether they are living matter or not, whether they're right there on the cusp between creatures or objects, and the fact that they're anthropomorphized, I think, is very interesting. How they're being endowed with a life. I think it's more interesting when you see it in contrast, and it just occurred to me with the data that I'm going to present, in which is the opposite. Human beings' experiences are being brought into graphics and completely inanimate objects, devoid of any kind of life. What I think is, again, interesting about what I'm going to present is a lot of it is things that we already know. You know, the disproportionate effect on minorities of the pandemic. But what I would like to bring is a different way of reading this data that I would call a humanities way of reading the data. So there is a traditional reading of the data that I'm going to present, and then I'm going to go into mine. I've presented some of this material before the pandemic to my students in classes where many of them were Latino or Latino immigrants. And many times they thought that I was overemphasizing the negatives. And now the pandemic has, I think, vindicated a lot of what I was saying before, but I have not had a chance of sharing it with the students again. So let me show you just very briefly. Oh, that's not, okay. So the COVID epidemic becomes a magnifying glass for pre-existing inequalities, really. The data show the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black, Latinx, Native American, and Asian American communities. I'm going to give you just the New York graphs very briefly. If you look at this, each one of these kind of blue blocks is a different ethnicity. So Hispanics are the first one, non-Hispanic American Indians, the second one, non-Hispanic Asian, non-Hispanic Black, and then white. Anything that goes up of the lines means there is a disproportionate amount of deaths to the actual representation of that group in society. You can see how huge the mountain for Latinos are in New York. Nationally is about the same, maybe slightly less. Nationally, the American Indian, I mean, this is their categories. I'm going to shift between Latinos and Hispanics because of the census and the CDC categories. So this one would be much bigger. In Long Island, they're underrepresented. But you can see, I mean, the last one, of course, is non-Hispanic white. So you can see that there has been a huge disproportion between the amount of people affected by deaths in the pandemic. If you are Hispanic, certainly you are Black, less so if you're Asian, and about the same as Asian for Native American. Now, if you go for age groups, this is again the disproportion for age groups, and you can see on the 1 to 3rd column, if you are a Hispanic person between 35 and 45 years of age, you have many more chances of dying of the pandemic. Unusual, we've been hearing about this, you know, impact on senior citizens, on people who are more advanced age. If you are Latino or Hispanic, chances are that you are a younger person when you are taken to the hospital and that you die. So it really, we don't know, but it seems to be that the fact that Hispanics are working in more dangerous conditions from the point of view of the virus has had this impact. This is well known. I'm not gonna lay a lot of weight on this, just beyond giving you the graphs that kind of confirm what we already know. These are from the CDC. I just cut and paste them there. They're available publicly. Now, why is this? So the Journal of American Medical Association says, why is this disproportions? As well as the disparity to unequal health resources, pre-existing conditions. So basically, you know, can be explained because of difficulty of engaging in social distances, because of crowding and occupation, because an increased disease severity, because of reduced access to healthcare. So the usual set of kind of systemic conditions that deal with or kind of explain from their point of view why Hispanics and Latinos get more impact. I would suggest this is actually not the reason for the events, but actually it's part of the condition itself. That these are not symptoms, these are part of the condition goes deeper. And let me just point at a few things that we know about Long Island. So segregation, and this is just from my map. you can see there where the Latino population is more concentrated on the island. Curiously enough, in 2010, which is the latest year, we'll have new ones from the new census now in 2020, but this is the latest information. In 2010, Nassau County ranked as America's most segregated among those of similar population, while Suffolk stood in 10th position. So we live in a highly segregated area of the United States. We might enter into discussions about what that means, but it really means for a population like Latino population who has been here for over 100 years, to remain so segregated means that in some kind of way, there is a perceived kind of border that separates Latinos from non-Latinos, Blacks from, Blacks is even more extreme in Suffolk County. There is like, I think 93 municipalities, and only in 10 of them, there are African-American communities. So we live in a highly segregated society. What does that mean? How does that impact the pandemic? There is also like political underrepresentation. Like you can see here, you can see Brentwood, and you see like the kind of gerrymandering that has gone there. Brentwood is actually parted through Main Street, north and south, so that Latinos don't get ever enough percentage of votes to elect a Latino representative. There's no Latino senator in the U.S. In the New York Senate. And with such a constant, thinking that the percentage of Latinos here in Brentwood is about 65 to 85, depending on which areas we're talking, it's almost amazing that political representation has been blocked. So we have segregation, political underrepresentation that are also underlying conditions. But they also point to, all these disproportionate deaths point to a deeper underlying political conditions. In 2012, a Southern Poverty Law Center study said that we live in a climate of fear, or Latinos live in a climate of fear. They basically concentrated or registered many of the violent incidents against Latinos. And they say in Suffolk County, there is a climate of fear. There is also recent political developments that have had an extreme impact on the border. We are all aware of that, through not only the Trump years, but also with the late Obama years. Deportations were at a height. So all these recent political developments, but the impact of those events is felt intensely on the immigrant communities across the country, not only on Long Island. Now, what I try to, and this is my humanities plate, what I try to think is that what we are living through is the consequences of something that I call low intensity necropolitics, in which migration has been linked to the immigrants having to demonstrate that their lives are worth saving in some kind of way. So they have to make themselves useful to the larger community, and therefore they have to demonstrate that their living energy can be used to save somebody else. So Latinos work disproportionately in second and third tier jobs in the hospital. Anybody who's been in the hospital, probably Spanish is the main language of the people who actually deal with the needs of the patients at the level of cleaning the room, bringing the food, cleaning the hospital, and many other things. Part of this low intensity necropolitics is the pathologization of immigration. The whole discourse that we have been hearing over the last years presents immigration as a sickness in itself. And therefore it goes without saying that, of course, they are already sick. They should be sicker with the pandemic. I'm talking tongue-in-cheek a little bit there. Just trying to make a point, maybe not very refinedly. But there's this concept of immigrant mourning. So immigrants themselves, the experience of migration generates a sense of pathology in the immigrants. And it's well recorded, this sense of many immigrants live with this kind of shadow of not being able to have it, of having lost a life they left behind, some kind of nostalgia for a life that they will never live anymore, the life they left behind in their countries of origins, and therefore they perceive themselves many times as lacking in some kind of psychological or physical sense. And then the other thing that is very interesting, our dominant narrative right now still is the national narrative. And immigrants transgress that narrative. Immigrants are a demonstration that the nations they left behind were not working properly. That's why they had to leave. And that the nations that they go to don't work properly. That's why they need their input and their, but symbolically they occupy what Derrida has said, or used to call a supplementary position. So they're both inside and outside the nation. And in doing so, they perform the symbolic work of buttressing the narrative of the nation. We have nations in many ways because immigrants are helping us to explain who those nations are. And by doing all that kind of work, immigrants are put in a position, in a necropolitical position of saying, you have to demonstrate, you have to gain your right to existence. And in doing so, they enter into all these other pre-existing conditions. So the effects of COVID upon different social groups are a guide to the ways in which a woven set of narratives about the roles of each group plays in our society as a whole. Again, low intensity because this is a concept from American warfare in the 1960s in Central America, in which they say, rather than an open war, we're going to have an everyday war in which every day people know that they are subject to violence, but they can still do their normal lives. Normal life is still able to happen. So that's why I think the current state of immigration, specifically with Latinos, but many other groups, is one of low intensity necropolitics. And that was my reinterpretation of the data. Thank you for listening. And that's it.
Wow. Thank you, Adrian. And that's very interesting. That's really great. Do we have questions or comments for Adrian? We have people clapping. Yes. Any questions or comments? We're at past time, so I don't know whether people need to jump off. I know some people already have, but if we've got questions, let's bring them. I really appreciated the explanation of the low intensity, using that from this sort of historical war in Central America. That's really interesting, and how we sort of make everyday life kind of a battle, right? So that's quite profound, Adrian. And
also because a lot of that kind of warfare is at the basis of the current migration that is happening from Central America.
Yes.
We are living the aftermath of that low intensity, which was, there's manuals. you can go. There's the CIA and the military put out manuals about how to wield that war. Yeah,
how to do that. Odalis has put a comment thanking you, Adrian, and important perspective, especially one that looks directly at Long Island. Yes, right, for sure.
If I may briefly, I forgot to tell you again that when I present this information to my students, immigrants are very much, of course, the bootstrap kind of thinking. So they kind of see this as going against the grain of the narratives of self-sacrifice and self-improvement that also have made migration successful in many ways. Yeah. So again, it feels that sometimes I'm presenting like the shadow of the successful immigrant narratives, but I think we are collectively sacrificing the lives of many people because we think they should bear these tensions and these pressures to demonstrate that they are not betraying the nation, that they are worthwhile, that they should pay the price of being here.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. Okay, I'm supposed to go last. I don't have to go unless people want to stay on for a few more minutes. How are we feeling? Sure. Okay. All right. I'll just go really quickly. Let me share my screen. Okay. Are you seeing this? Yes. Okay. Comic says pedagogy. So I'm going to be pretty quick about this. I've got it all written out, so hopefully it'll go quickly. But so I sort of always take a multimodal approach to my pedagogy. And so whatever topic I'm doing, I've really tried to work on this to kind of think about getting them to work across forms, genres, exercises, and assignments. I'm going to sort of talk about some examples of that. And comics and graphic narratives, I think everybody knows this about me, but they've become a key component to my pedagogy, both in terms of the material. So I'm teaching these comics and graphic narratives in all of my classes. And I'm also trying to kind of create activities that I've sort of learned from looking at comics and graphic narratives. So also, I'm interested in kind of the brief description of what I'm sort of interested in is disability and illness in action in particular times and places. And so I've found the kind of subfield of graphic medicine really important to both my scholarship and my teaching. So this is the graphic medicine website. If you don't know about it, I really recommend it. It links with a lot of the presentations that we've already had in terms of, Karen knows this because she attended one of my classes where we had the cartoonist M.K. Serwick talking about the COVID image. And you can see, so this is the page, and they have a bunch of projects ongoing directly related to COVID-19. They have the COVID-19 comics project, which has lots of different cartoons and comics and under different themes. And then they also have been doing throughout the pandemic, the drawing together where people get together to draw on Zoom, and they have an archive of those things that have been produced in those activities. So what I'm going to talk about are two things really briefly. Annotation as a method of visual analysis. This is going to kind of connect to some other of the presentations. I'm not going to read this all to you, but you can see this is how I get students to annotate a visual image, and I instruct them on how to do this. And I sort of make it into a two-part activity where they take notes on the image and then they interpret. So the other thing that I've really tried to get them to do, and was it Karen who said looking is a skill? I've actually sort of incorporated a sort of trying to get them to look multiply at the image. So to look and take notes and to then go away, do something else, and then go back again. And actually, when I've done this with classes, I've been pleasantly surprised. I didn't sort of tell them to do this, but students have actually started to break down their notes into first look, second look. And what's really interesting about this is it sort of creates a structure of looking and where they kind of do a sort of analysis of what they saw the first time. So they sort of realize, oh, I saw this the first time, but I didn't see this. So it really creates this sort of structure. And then once they've done this descriptive work of annotation, then I have them interpret, and so write a kind of interpretation of the image. So I'm going to show you, Karen, I think, has seen this. I'm showing you the work of a really exceptional student, but I wanted to sort of give a sense of what this looks like. So if they can actually, this is sort of digitally annotated, if they can do that in classes, I often have handouts. In in-person classes, I have handouts where they actually write on the image. And this is really, I think this kind of work of actually writing on the image, either by hand or digitally, is really useful. If they don't have the tools to do this, I just have them take notes separate. But you can see where the writing on the image actually helps you to look. So, and you can see what this student, Ashley Chopra, from my first year seminar last semester did. You can see that she's put arrows, right? She's circled things that are on the image, right? She's sort of literally pointed to or pointed away from a very specific aspect of the image. If you think about what that's doing hand to brain, right? That's very interesting process where she's actually saying, look at this, I'm looking at this, and here's what I see. So it's kind of verbal visual work that I think is really important. So the other thing that I do, trying to go really quickly here, is I've been in several of my classes since the pandemic started. I've been having them work on a documenting COVID-19 project, and there are several options. And one of them is the comics option, where they make their own comic. And you can see that I just describe it pretty simplistically. Even the 4-panel thing, I'm very flexible about that. If they want to do something else, they can run it by me. I'm just sort of trying to get them to think in visually about a comic and create that comic. And I highly recommend this in terms of getting them to sort of find a way, a mode to express sort of some of their experiences of the pandemic. Now I'm going to show you, this is again the same student. This is part of her comic that she created. Now, let me just say something at first, and this is brilliant. And this is actually has been cataloged on the graphic medicine website in their COVID comic. So I asked her if I could share it. She said yes, and she's, I think, happy to have it up there. She's obviously a very talented artist who did this amazing comic. But I want to say something a little bit about that. Obviously, students don't have to be an artist like Ashley was to create. And I think, Karen, you showed some examples of drawing that is maybe less skilled, but nonetheless reveals a lot of emotion and experience. And one of the things, and I'm just going to finish with this, that I had some amazing conversations with first-year students. So I taught this first-year seminar on basically that was looking at the AIDS epidemic, looking at COVID-19 through the lens of HIV/AIDS pandemic. And obviously that was very close to what they were living in that moment, but also first-year students, some of whom, as Ashley is showing you here, were actually still in their childhood homes taking their classes, right? So this was sort of one of their experiences. And then the other experience, I had several students who were on campus, so first-year students who were on campus, who were very isolated and alone and felt that it was quite difficult. And actually, I had these very interesting conversations about how to draw that. And the stick figure kind of ended up sort of standing in really emotional and important ways for these students, for their experience. So I had some conversations with students who were really struggling, and they said, oh, I can't draw, I can't do this, but in fact what they created, what they produced was really showed something about how they felt about their experience. So it was actually very moving, and I'm going to stop the share now and stop there. Thank you for hanging on. Any questions? Thanks, Karen. Yeah, looking as a skill. Yeah, Christina.
I definitely am going to take your annotating directly on the image activity and start handing out printouts in class of some art historical images, because that's
no, and you can do it with anything, right? So I'm doing it with comics, but also it can work actually with written stuff too. I mean, you can actually say you want to annotate this written piece. It could work with like a policy document as well. forcing them to do it. But yeah, but for visual images, it's really important. And, you know, Kay is mentioning Linda Berry's point that everybody can draw. I mean, yes, this is motivating me as well. Linda Berry sort of talks about how when we're children, we all draw and we love it, and we all, you know, enjoy, we get pleasure out of it. But then we at some point stop drawing and also stop thinking that we can draw or that we would get pleasure from it. And so Linda Berry has all these exercises that help you kind of go back to that feeling of having the capacity to draw, which, yeah, is one of the things I'm also trying to get students to appreciate. Thank you, everyone. Wow, that was a lot. I want to just say to everyone, yay, that was really great. Such great presentations from everyone. And thank you all for sharing. And, you know, there's a link in the chat to the website, but we've got other stuff. What's next coming up? Karen, do you have it right there that maybe we can tell everybody?
I don't have it right in front of me. Okay. And I would say the website, there's a lot of stuff that we're still building it. So some things work and some things don't. We're building it out. I think the next event is either the town hall event through the Humanities Institute or the podcasting event. And then Alice Wong is in October. Those are the three coming up.
So we will, you all are all on our, list. I hope if you, thank you for coming today to everybody who came and participated, and we will be in touch about more events to come because there's a lot more stuff going on. And thank you again to the Humanities Institute for helping us out with all this. Adrian, go ahead.
Could I put a plug for tomorrow? We have, in the spirit of this event too, we have an event about the teaching and pedagogy of critical race theory at 6 p.m. and you're all welcome. Together with this event, I think we all thought that there is a lot of pedagogy and new teaching that we are developing in order to address these questions of what we call the immediate present or the pressing matters in the Institute. So I want to invite you to that. It's at 6 p.m. tomorrow on critical race theory and the pedagogy and teaching of it.
Yeah, very important. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you. And thank you, Lisa, for organizing. This is,
okay.
Lisa got this together and it's been absolutely fabulous. So thank you.
Great format, Lisa.
And we will put the recording on the website. If we can figure out how to do that, we will do that. So watch this space. Okay, thanks to everyone. Bye, have a good day.